Welcome to the debate. Our world today is really grappling with concepts that suggest a growing collective disconnect from reality. I mean, we're talking about everything from digital echo chambers and post-truth politics to, generational coping mechanisms like quiet quitting and this idea of Delulu culture.
Right. It feels like a very confusing intellectual landscape. And the real question is, are these signs of a genuinely new crisis in how we process information, or are they just, well, modern names for the same cognitive flaws that have been with us forever?
And that really gets to our core disagreement for today. Does the severity of collective self-deception and polarization we see everywhere stem primarily from these fundamental, unchanging human cognitive mechanisms? Or is it being driven chiefly by, unique structural factors in our digital world and undercurrent economic pressures?
I'm going to argue that what we're seeing is merely a highly visible contemporary manifestation of perennial human cognitive flaws. The architecture of the mind is constant. The technology is just a new stage.
And I'll be arguing that the scale of this is different, that it's being structurally amplified by digital and economic forces that have fundamentally altered the pathways to truth and made our environment uniquely hostile to rationality.
Okay, so let's start with the constancy of the human mind. The persistent appearance of what we call delusion is, I think, rooted in the unchanging design of our mental architecture. I mean, take something like motivated reasoning, the tendency to build a case for our beliefs like a lawyer. You already know the conclusion and you just find facts to support it. That's a constant cognitive bias. It's always been there. It's what makes us fall for something like the narrative fallacy.
I agree with the observation, of course, that motivated reasoning is timeless, but I draw a totally different conclusion about its impact today. The severity of collective self-deception we're seeing, it's a structural problem that's amplified by the systems we now live in. Look at polarization. The digital environment with its algorithmic curation and homophilia, this tendency for like-minded people to cluster. It doesn't just reflect existing divides. It intensifies the echo chamber effect to a, frankly, unprecedented degree. So this means people don't just differ on policy. They exist in fundamentally different factual narratives about everything from climate science to basic history. The environment structurally rewards that kind of thinking.
But the human mind's need for that order, for that narrative truth, has always been the primary vulnerability. Think about that narrative fallacy again. It lures us into believing we can explain this messy, random past with simple cause and effect stories. We build these tidy narratives for success stories like Steve Jobs, and we completely ignore the role of luck and regression to the mean. This craving for simple stories is just hardwired into us. It's evident in the dual system approach to belief, which suggests our default D system, it just prefers beliefs that fit with our core values in this effortless Spinozan way. It prioritizes what's true enough over what's actually capital T truth.
That's precisely the point. The internet is built from the ground up to exploit that D system. But before we get deeper into cognitive architecture, let's just look at the economic side. There is a structural imperative that's forcing widespread self-deception just as a coping mechanism. The so-called delusional thinking, the quiet quitting, these are often a perfectly logical response to an objectively untenable economic situation. When the predictable narrative that past generations relied on, you work hard, you can buy a house, is proven false by structural economic breakdown, well, that sense of futility becomes completely overwhelming.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the economic landscape is the cause of self-deception. It's just the new target for our persistent failure of logic. I mean, if we look at the claims about changing personality traits, like the whole panic over a narcissism epidemic or Generation Me, we have to be deeply skeptical. The early meta-analyses that suggested this huge spike in self-regard, like that reported 0.33 standard deviation increase in NPI scores, they've been repeatedly challenged.
Right, that has been largely debunked.
Exactly. Subsequent, much larger research, using the exact same method, found that the supposed cohort effect, it just disappears. The differences in narcissism are much more robustly linked to age, what we could call developmental me. As people mature, rather than being some unique generational signature.
It is fascinating, I agree, that after all that media panic, the data points back to just basic human development. However, we have to address the difference between the stability of the underlying trait score and the contextualized performance of that trait. So even if we grant that narcissism scores are stable, the social media environment creates a structural imperative to constantly perform greatness. These platforms reward vanity. They reward this perfect, curated self-image, regardless of the internal reality.
But why is that a structural failing and not just the latest expression of an evolutionary advantage? I mean, that drive for self-enhancement is ancient. Self-deception itself, things like selective recall bias where we remember our good deeds better than our bad ones, or just unrealistic optimism, it's theorized to have evolved precisely to help us deceive others, which conferred real social and financial benefits. The modern performance of success is it's the digital optimization of that deep-seated trait for a new mass audience.
You're arguing the drive is constant, and I agree, but the system dramatically changes the cost of failure and the pressure to perform. The resulting psychological conflict, this defensive, fragile, high self-esteem, is genuinely destabilizing in a way that, ancient forms of hubris confined to a small village simply were not. And this structural imperative isn't just about vanity. It's about exploiting cognitive vulnerabilities for profit.
Okay, let's focus on that cognitive vulnerability then. We both agree on the importance of the dual system model, right? The fast, effortless D system versus the slow, effortful C system for critical scrutiny.
And I contend that the shift in our socio-epistemic environment fundamentally changes the pathways to truth by prioritizing that D system. When information is delivered in an endless scroll with character limits and emotionally charged headlines, the whole system is designed to bypass critical scrutiny. It exploits our mental shortcuts. And that's why complex claims, like the nuanced rise and fall of a global business, get reduced to these simple emotional stories that completely ignore luck.
Complexity certainly requires multiple perspectives. But if we're going to assign blame, we need to focus on the lack of cognitive resilience, not just the delivery platform. The data shows that mastering core critical thinking skills, like distinguishing causation from correlation, strongly correlates with a person's ability to reject misinformation. Yet the same sources show that short interventions, like educational videos trying to inoculate people against bias, are often pretty ineffective at training those deep skills.
I'm just not convinced by that because it places all the accountability on the user, ignoring the intentional design of the system. We have to acknowledge that the media ecosystem is structurally designed to exploit those weaknesses, to make critical thinking actively harder. When your political identity is reconfigured around tribal adherence, facts stop being empirical claims. They become badges of personal identity. And the decision to actually use your C system to criticize a claim that your tribe supports, that becomes incredibly costly. It risks expulsion.
But that tribalism is ancient. That is the very definition of motivated reasoning. We are prone to confirmation bias because belonging feels good. The internet just makes those tribal signals instantaneous and global. It doesn't invent the impulse. And what's more, the capacity for analytical thought has been shown to decline as print reading decreases and visual media use increases, a trend that actually predates the modern internet. This suggests an enduring erosion of the cognitive skills you need to even use the System C, regardless of how fast the feed scrolls.
I appreciate that focus on historical data, but the context has fundamentally changed. The internet allows for what we might call structurally generated incoherence. For example, when an alternative media source's entire legitimacy comes from questioning the objectivity of mainstream institutions. The environment structurally reinforces the idea that all facts are negotiable, making critical scrutiny feel pointless. The system rewards rejecting objective data entirely.
Okay, I take your point on the institutional challenge, but let's shift back to prediction and self-deception. The narrative fallacy, which is a pure failure of logic, induces this illusion of understanding and makes us believe we can predict the future. This perennial failure leads to massive business failures, the downfall of titans like Sony or Citigroup. The conviction that we control our destiny is a cognitive error rooted in hubris, and that's true regardless of the economy.
That's an interesting point.
Though I would frame it differently. While false prediction is a failure of logic, the widespread sense of futile action, this profound feeling among younger people that the future I worked my whole life for is unattainable, that is a direct result of economic realities that invalidate the old predictable narratives. When the expected inputs, like a college degree and hard work, no longer produce the expected outputs, like a secure life and affordable housing, the whole narrative just breaks down.
But the human mind has always needed a way to cope with the randomness of life. The realization that luck has always been a massive factor in success, that's terrifying.
Exactly. And when the structural reality is so profoundly sick that traditional effort isn't rewarded, people turn to delusional thinking, or delulu, as a structural coping mechanism. It's a refusal to accept the deeply unjust reality that the system is only built for survival, not success. This widespread economic nihilism is structural, not just a random cognitive failure. It's the only way to retain a sense of agency when rational effort fails.
But the craving for narrative is what betrays us. The very mechanisms that let us store information efficiently are the ones that cause our worst mistakes. The nihilism you describe is just the emotional response to a failure to recognize the constancy of luck and the unreliability of simple stories.
And recognizing those factors becomes impossible when the structure rewards simplified narratives and the economic ground shifts so much that the old simple message of triumph is unattainable for most people. That combination creates the unique strain we see. So, to sort of wrap up, we've explored how the current sense of collective self-deception and polarization is. It's just profoundly magnified by the structural conditions of the digital age. This environment favors rapid, effortless, and tribal belief, exploiting our D system, and it imposes these unsustainable performance demands that make individual cognitive resilience incredibly difficult to achieve.
Yeah, and I come at it from a different perspective. We have to remain grounded in the constancy of human nature. The patterns we see, motivated reasoning, selective skepticism, this perennial impulse to label the next generation as entitled, these are enduring psychological phenomena. The challenge, for me, lies in addressing the human craving for certainty and narrative truth, which technology is merely exploiting in new high-speed ways.
But it is the speed, the scale, and the institutional erosion caused by that structural exploitation that separates our current moment from the past.
And it's the constancy of our flawed, narrative-craving minds that determines how vulnerable we remain, regardless of the platform.
I think we have to recognize that truly understanding this post-truth condition requires appreciating the tension between these two forces, the unchanging, flawed mechanisms of human cognition and the radical amplifying pressures of our modern socio-epistemic environment.
Absolutely. There is always more to explore in examining that complex interplay between the mind and the world it is trying to understand.